American Studies, the American Studies concentration at Gunnell College in Gunnell, Iowa. She earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University and received a BA and a master's degree in African Studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Katya has written and published widely. She wrote a book called Black, Jewish, Interracial. It's not the color of your skin, but the race of your kin, and other myths of identity. That was with Duke University Press, and deals with issues of identity in the public sphere. Journals in which her articles have appeared. She's written articles, review essays, and position papers in the American Anthropologist, the American Ethnologist, biography, developing world bioethics, identities, cultural studies, research in African literature, and Noga, the first Israeli feminist journal, and she's written widely in the media as well. So it's really wonderful that you're back, and Katya went through the program, and she's been lecturing on the program, so it's great that you're back here in the family.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
So, first of all, I'm going to do a few different things, and it's not going to be a lecture. It's not going to be. I'm going to give you some of my reflections, some of my insights, both from being in the workshop 2 years ago, then presenting last year, and also doing a lecture under ISGAP at Columbia University a year ago, and coming back and hearing you yesterday a little bit of the conversations that were taking place. And so that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm also going to ask you some questions that will be interactive. So there's an hour and a half. For me, that's never enough, but that's true for all of you, because we're all, most of us, faculty. And one thing about faculty is that faculty talk, and for every question, there's like a half-hour answer. So you also know children of faculty in a classroom, because they know when to tune out. Okay, I have a couple of things to start out with. Let me give you a bit of background on myself, and I'm going to stand up so I can see everybody. Mainly because when I'm asked certain questions, I tend not necessarily to answer, or I tailor my answers on my mood or on the tone of the question. Some of you will be familiar with the idea of having antenna, internal antenna that go up. So when you're asked, where are you from? You decide if you're going to answer and how you're going to answer that question, because the question is never about where are you from. It's what box do I put you in? What category do I put you in? How do I read your body and your body language? Or why are you speaking English without an accent? Or what is that accent, or what are those faces? Which is partially why my book was titled, not the color of your skin, but the race of your kin. Okay, so my mother was a refugee. She passed away 3 years ago. My mother was a...
Your hair is just...
My hair's in the way.
Yeah. Are you able to either move this or tie that back?
Yes, I can tie this back. I can even tie it this way. It's fake. That's a different story. That's a whole other story. I might get to it. But my mother was a refugee from Nazi Austria. My grandmother's sister lived in America. She was a nurse. She was also very beautiful. She worked for a doctor. My grandmother called her sister and said, if you don't get us out, I'm going to turn on the gas. My grandmother in 1933 already sensed what was happening. She was very, very insightful. And so the United States did not want Jews. Jews were not white then. And I will come back to that question of color and of race. My aunt, her sister, went to the doctor that she worked for, and the story is that she got on her knees and begged, I always cried at this time, and begged for the affidavit. Affidavits are still in use. There's nothing wrong in principle with affidavits. But to get to the United States, you do need someone who is going to vouch for you so that you're not a ward of the state. If you don't have anybody, then you're not going to get the entry visa. Long story short, my grandmother was my grandmother's sister was able to get that, and so my grandmother, her 2 children, and my grandfather were able to get visas to the United States. My grandfather's mother was not. Okay? Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the 1950s, the United States government, in being anti-communist, would allow all the anti-communists from Hungary to come in. But they weren't going to let the Jews of Hungary come in. And so she and my grandfather's sister were murdered in the camps. So I take the Holocaust, the Shoah, very, very seriously. It's something I grew up with. When I see trains in Europe, when I'm in Europe and I'm on the trains are never just wonderful vehicles to be on. When I'm in the train stations, I don't see what tourists see, and clearly there are generational differences. So that's one aspect. My father is from Jamaica, and that's also complicated because his great-grandfather was Scottish, and in any case, Jamaicans, especially for those of you who are familiar with Stuart Hall, know that Jamaica and the Caribbean in general has a very interesting demographic mix. Given those two, everything I say is shorthand, so just keep that in mind. Given those two sides of my family, and having grown up in the United States, again, it's by chance, but growing up in the United States, and specifically growing up in New York City, that is Manhattan to those of you who think Brooklyn and Queens are New York, that's also generational. I grew up as, at the time, Negro and Jewish, and then in the 60s, of course, Black and Jewish. And that is how I self-identify, with the conjunction and. Again, calling on Stuart Hall, it is much easier theoretically for a younger generation to theorize the notion of intersectionality with the vocabulary of intersectionality. But I grew up with that way long ago. So today, I find it very offensive to hear the word mixed race, which has now been institutionalized, especially, or in England, with the marriage of Merkel to Prince Henry. I say all of that because it's very important to think about the ways in which notions and the vocabulary of race and the vocabulary of ethnicity and the vocabulary of nationality travel differently and resonate differently around the world. So in France, there is no racial category in the social sciences. What there is are translations from American English. And the racial categories in the United States have never been stable. They have changed over time, and they do not begin in 1776. They begin with the end, in the 19th century, they really begin with the end of slavery. This is something that younger people do not know and often are not taught. And this is something which faculty members who are in their 40s also often have not been taught. Therefore, they don't teach it. Therefore, we have an idea in the United States that race is somehow real, inherent in the body. And we mistake, often, race as a euphemism for color. So, African American, Black, Caucasian. Caucasian is not exactly a synonym for white. It really refers to Chechens, which is why there was a problem in the American media with the Boston bomber a few years ago. So the current debate in American Jewish circles in particular, and the forward in particular of the particular, the current debate over whether Jews are white is itself a problematic that needs to be interrogated. So let me backtrack now. I'll take this off. Was that clear? Was that, you're following my logic somewhat? Okay. I want to start just with a couple of comments and then move into a couple of questions. The first is, I have come to identify or to articulate the notion of racism as something which is very obvious, very blatant, often. But there's also what I call bloodless racism. And bloodless racism is very discreet. It's almost not noticeable. It's subtle. You feel it. That's the notion of antenna that I'm speaking about. In some ways, for those of you who recently saw the film Get Out, I would say you could use it until he goes to the ground, of course, but you could use that as an example. Anti-Semitism works the same way in some places. So I'm at Grinnell College, which is in the Midwest, and in the Midwest, there's what's called Midwest friendly, Minnesota nice, Iowa nice. Everybody's very nice. Everybody smiles nicely. It's the exact opposite of Israel. And I forgot to put into my bio that I made Aliyah at the age of 18. I was a member of Hashemet Tza'il. I did not go to kibbutz. I went when I was 18, and I stayed. I never thought of coming back to the States. I didn't have an affinity to the States. I wasn't raised to think of myself as American, particularly just as Jewish and as black, belonging to two histories. And I decided just before my oldest went into 12th grade that I kind of wanted to see what it would be like in the States. I applied to one school, that was Duke. I did get in. I didn't like it when I visited, but I'd only applied to one school, and I thought, I'm not going to turn this down. And one reason I didn't like it was because the head of the department, who happened to be Jewish, in principle, was also virulently anti-Israel. But I didn't know that, so I'm coming from Israel with my own grown-up consciousness of just taking Israeliness for granted and Zionism for granted and not quite understanding the hostility. But I did go to Duke, and I ended up staying. I changed my topic, and I stayed, and that's how I got to Grinnell eventually. So bloodless racism and bloodless anti-Semitism on my campus in the niceness functions this way. Nobody talks about Jews. And at Grinnell, no one is going to challenge me. This is why I say it's going to be very specific to people and personality and place. Nobody's going to challenge my position on Israel to my face blatantly. Instead, it's very quiet. What is that quiet? It means any recommendation that I've sent to the Peace and Conflict Committee for speakers just doesn't go anywhere. And I'm not going to be confrontational. I'm confrontational enough on other topics. So there's certain things I'm not going to be confrontational about because we all have budget limitations. When discussions about a Middle East minor, we call it concentrations, came up, I was not on that committee. The person on that committee was somebody with whom I had an argument when I first arrived at Grinnell. We were discussing topics to teach. I was discussing how not to teach race. I was opposed to a particular physical anthropology candidate whose work was on forensic sciences. And so that was our conversation. But as our conversation heated up, she turned to me, she got up and she said to me, very heatedly, "You're a Zionist." That was the real objection to my presence, and we kept that tension forever. In other words, it wasn't that I was black, that there was a sort of aggressive, passive-aggressive attitude. It was specifically that I was adamantly, and continue to be, a Zionist. What is Zionism? I believe the definition is the Jewish national liberation movement of the Jewish people. I also believe that it is very important not to allow corrupt elements, I'm going to put it that way, to appropriate certain types of principles and political positions. This has often come up in the context of other political movements. Women's choice being appropriated by pro-life, as if those who choose have the right to choose are anti-life. And that's where vocabulary becomes very, very important. And if you give up certain principles, you can lose the battle. So another example would be flags. What do we do with national symbols? In the United States, for those who want to fly the American flag has been appropriated by a very xenophobic nationalist group. Is it possible to retrieve that? If you put a flag on your garden, in your yard, are you saying that you are today, in today's language, a supporter of Trump? Well, that's a discussion I'll leave to Americans. But for Israelis, if you take the Israeli flag, if you take the national symbol of Israel, are you therefore saying that you are anti-Arab Muslim or anti-Arab Christian? Well, the answer to that has got to be no, because on Saturday night, some of you may know, there was a demonstration of over 100,000 people, many of whom were Druze, in opposition to the nationality law which has just passed, all of whom said that the symbol, the flag, was also their flag. The nationalist movement wants to appropriate the flag, wants to appropriate the Star of David. So I'm throwing a lot of different things out, but I hope that you're all smart. We all do this all the time, that you're able to make certain connections. So, subtle anti-Semitism, campus politics. Campus politics are about marketing of competing ideas. Okay? But do we really market ideas? Do we really provide students with the ability to deal with ideas that are very different, sometimes radically different, than those which they came into the classroom with, or in terms of the courses which they choose? I would argue that today, students who are in political science and economics tend to be less judgmental sometimes than students in the humanities, literature, philosophy, and so forth. They're not going to argue as much with the core elements of a course. They're not going to say, that's not true. They're not going to come in with an antagonistic attitude. But they will for certain topics. That's where we get into the question of identities. Are students' identities being challenged? Are faculty members' identities being challenged by the courses they offer? Are students' identities being challenged by the courses that they choose to take or not take? I think in that context that you can think about the notion of the classes that you're going to be teaching that are related to anti-Semitism. Target audience. Who are your target audiences in the plural? What is your campus like? Who are the different groups on your campus? How do they position themselves? How do they situate themselves in different contexts? If they're Jewish, if they're not Jewish, if they have a left background, if they have a religious background, if they're very secular, if they're Muslim, if they're Christian, which denomination of Christianity, all that is going to make a very, very big difference. And so therefore, there's no single formula for how to create a syllabus or what course to offer or how to tailor your choice of material. So I put here also professor and positionality. This is not something that you discuss necessarily with your students, but this is something that you have to discuss, I think, with yourself. You have to think to yourself, who am I? What am I bringing to the classroom? And I don't mean in the navel-gazing sense. I mean in the intellectual, philosophical, political sense. What are your red lines? So I have certain red lines. My red line, and it is in fact the red line that I choose to share with students so there'd be no ambiguity, it's that I am not the encyclopedia, I am not the expert, I am not omniscient, omnipotent, and so forth. They may think so, but I'm not. But I do have positions, and one of the positions is that I am not open to debate over the right, we're talking for anti-Semitism, okay, so this is a principle. I am not open to debating the right of Israel to exist. I'm not open to debating the right of Jews to have a national liberation movement. That movement ended, there's a consciousness, there is a state. Those are not open to debate. To open them to debate is to say, let's have a debate over the validity of national liberation movements in general, which would automatically call into question Palestinian national identity, automatically call into question Vietnamese national liberation identity and the Vietnam-American War and so forth. You can provide many different examples. So is one opposed to national liberation movements and the idea of nationalism in general? That'd be one question. So having taken that off the table, I don't start with that as my point of departure in my class and in my syllabus. All of that thinking goes on before the syllabus is created. This is what I'm suggesting to you, that you have to think about not just the specifics of your course, but what are the goals, what are the long-term goals behind assembling and collecting the material that you're going to use in your course. So that's target audience. And it's going to be different depending on the institution that you're in. Institution and collegial support. As you think about your syllabi, as you think about your selection of material, film, text, visuals, and I'm very bad with visuals. This is like my best attempt. You want to think about, are you going to be supported? Are you going to be undermined without your knowing that you're being undermined? And the undermining is not somebody being blatant and saying, oh, I don't accept her ideas. I don't agree with her. That's easy. That's why subtle racism is much, much more difficult to deal with than in-your-face racism. Because in-your-face racism, you can respond to. You can walk away from. But when somebody smiles and seems to be very nice, but in the boardroom are using all kinds of subtle vocabulary that everybody understands, and you can tape it and you can play it, but you can't prove that that's actually a racist act, an anti-Semitic act, a homophobic act, because it's the tone of voice, it's the gesture, it's the eye contacts that you can see in the room that are taking place, that are communicating. That's not conspiratorial. Okay? So do you have institutional and collegial support for the course that you're teaching? And I would suggest that where you do, that's wonderful. Where you don't, it may be very useful to identify what are some of the disagreements or conflicts that exist behind the scenes, and then work them subtly into your classroom. State them. Say what they are. Give the students the vocabulary with which to be able to hear and to notice when subtle anti-Semitic remarks are made. So a specific example. This is not subtle. A course that's offered on the Middle East, but never mentions Israel. A course that's offered on the history of Arabia. There are no Jews. Jews existed in Arabia before there was Islam. It's not something new. So that's the kind of thing that you can integrate into your classroom discussions, so at least students will hear for the first time, maybe, that, oh, you know, Jews are kind of indigenous to this part of the world, not just to Europe. And I will come back to that. Definitions. Again, definitions are partially the definitions that you have on your own when you come into the classroom, and definitions that you want to state explicitly to your students, that you want to work into your syllabi. So one definition is, do you use the term identity in the singular or in the plural? It's a big difference. Identities in the plural is what we all have. Much of the theory still uses identity in the singular, which means that people are being cataloged, which means that there's no space to discuss contradictions, paradoxes, complex issues. Finally, ambiguities and contradictions, especially dealing with the issue of the Middle East. So I would like now to take a 5-minute break and have you turn, those at the table turn to the people on the sides in a group of 4. And the question that I want you to ask very quickly of each other, there's space, I took a chair here. And ask or answer the following question, which may seem to be a simplistic question. Where are your people from? Now, this is not a question about who do you identify with. This is a question simply about geography and memory. An example that I have is that I have a colleague whose husband is Ethiopian, and their daughter, from the time that she could speak, was taught to name 9 generations back of family. And she takes it for granted. Most people can't do that. And many Jews whose background is Ashkenazi European, like mine, are not able to do that very well, partially because everybody's dead. So it disappears. I mean, I have photographs. I didn't pay close attention when my mother would say, this is so-and-so and this is so-and-so. It's not a biblical record. So make a group of 4 and identify, it's probably only going to be countries, but if it's countries, you want to think to yourself that if you're thinking of a country in 1890, well, that country is not the country of today. So just get a sense of the diversity in your own backgrounds. 5 minutes. Roots, R-O-O-T-S, and roots, R-O-U-T-E-S. Yes.
Excuse me, just before you do this, excuse me just for a second, I have a quick announcement. Our colleague and somebody who's been very instrumental in ISGAP just arrived. So Professor Olufemi Von just arrived from Nigeria, stopping here, going back to the US. Welcome, so you know, just so you know who he is. Thank you.
So this is 5 minutes.
Terribly sorry for me barging in.
Oh, that's fine. No, it's fine. It always feels like I'm going zigzag, but that's slang.
Yeah. It's good. Actually, we've talked about it. I had a grandfather from Vienna. And as a child, so my parents were very active my mother was a feminist and very active in politics. And very active in the Jewish community. And I remember my grandparents lived in Miami. We used to drive from Montreal. They were the type of parents who would stop in cotton fields and then make us pick cotton to see how thorny it was and how difficult. And showed us tar paper shacks. Anyways, I think in '66 they went to Jamaica. They came back with reggae music, the Stars of David and Zion and Jerusalem. So we grew up with reggae. So I didn't know your father was a Jamaican.
Yeah.
So for me, Jamaica, I know like the Marleys, I became friendly with them. It's all I had friends that were musicians, so I became connected to Jamaica.
Have you been to Curacao?
No.
It's not very pretty, except for that main. That's it. That's the picture poster. But they market their tourist market is specifically for the Jews and Africa. Curacao. They have I don't know if it's still active in Jamaica. I don't know. I've only been 3 times. But in Curacao they have the sand in the synagogue, the old Sephardi synagogue, and they keep it up.
Also, the reggae music is very biblical, very Torah-based.
Yeah.
It energizes me when I do all this shit.
Oh, yes.
Where are you going after this? To Paris?
We're going to go to London. We're going to take the boat to Portsmouth. The same thing we did last year. It seemed to be easier, and also I wasn't sure if there were going to be train strikes. So Urim has a place also in Normandy, right on the water.
Oh, really?
It's small, but it's really cute. And there'll never be anything built in front. It's right on, yes. And then we go back to the States August 23rd.
It's like in a village or something? Is it in a small town?
Lyon-sur-Mer. Yeah, it's small. It's like, 15 paces, and then you're in the next one. Hermonville, I think. So it's in Normandy. So it's nice. It's relaxing. I still have 2 syllabi to do. But, the rabbi at the college apparently resigned. I'm very happy. The rabbi at the college resigned. I'm happy to be very happy, but I don't know what happened.
They weren't so nice?
Well, this was just somebody who had decided that he was, thank you, he decided that he was the head of the Jewish community. I mean, I don't know what the story is, but I know that I complained to the dean about the fact that when I asked, why don't we have a Jewish studies person dedicated in religious studies, of all places, but we should have it outside, but we don't have anybody. A faculty member said to me, oh, you should speak to the rabbi about that. And I went and I said, would you accept it if I asked about Christian history and I was told to speak to the chaplain? I mean, I'm like the only I'm the only Jewish faculty member. Right? So when I said that, the dean and says, "Oh, but," and he goes through the last names. But these are no. So I've been pushing for years to at least put forward a job proposal that asks for Hebrew familiarity with Hebrew and Arabic.
If you would get a philanthropist to fund it, they would choke.
I would very much like to have an ISGAP event at Grinnell before I retire.
Let's do it. I'd be honored.
Yeah, I think I might. So I'm teaching the course second. I'm going to get to my course. Okay. I have no doubt.
I always wanted to learn how to do that.
I don't always succeed. It's been years. It just happened to work this time. Okay. I know that this is really exciting. And I know that you would really like to continue this discussion and not listen, because all you've done for a week and a half is listen. And unfortunately, you have to listen some more. Okay, so I'm not, if this was a smaller group, and what I do in my class, because it is smaller, is I actually go around and I ask everybody, I don't divide them up, I ask at the outset, where are your people from? And inevitably, there'll be somebody who says, but I don't identify, and I'll have to remind them, this is not about your identity. In the context of the US, it's if you're not a native indigenous person, then you came from someplace. What you can say is, I don't know. And that is a history lesson of erasure. The lack of knowledge is erasure. Just quickly to put into a parenthesis, because I think it's important, is this list of definitions of who is a Jew in Nazi Germany. This is Nuremberg. Okay? So it's arbitrary, but it's not arbitrary for people's lives. It made a difference for people's lives. And if you haven't seen the film, I mentioned it to you yesterday, just Raoul Peck in general. This is a footnote. If you have not yet seen Raoul Peck's Baldwin, I highly recommend it. If you have, Baldwin. If you have not yet seen Raoul Peck's The Young Karl Marx, I strongly recommend it. Because Raoul Peck, who is Haitian and French, a filmmaker, brilliant. He's director of the French film school. I can't remember the name of the film school in Paris that he's there, but you can look that up. He has, in this film on the young Karl Marx, this is what is his brilliance as a filmmaker. He makes reference to Karl Marx's Jewish background. This is not something I believe an American would have done. But Raoul Peck does. And the reference is simply at a certain point, the young Karl Marx turns to his friend and laughs at the irony of the fact that he is the son of a convert, just somebody Jewish who converted, who married the daughter of an anti-Semitic aristocrat. And it's just thrown into the film. And there are a couple of other things about anti-Semitism that are thrown in that if you don't notice, you wouldn't know it was there. But of course, I noticed, so I'm able to say what a wonderful thing that Raoul Peck did. But okay, students don't know this. Most students know very little about the Holocaust. And one of the problems of a younger generation and social media and access to information is that there's overflow of information and there's overflow of data that they can go to, and there's overflow of images of horror. So in that overflow, everything is horrible. Every massacre is horrible. And the trick is how to get younger people to understand that the question isn't comparing. It's not a compare-contrast. Whose massacre was worse? I also recommend a film that we've just seen. It's actually available on Amazon. In different countries, you have different access. But it's called The Insult. And it's by the Lebanese-French director, Ziad Doueri. I know I'm mispronouncing his name. And he has been boycotted several times because of his filming another film that also was excellent, The Assault in Israel. But again, those would be another film that I would recommend because it opens up discussions about Israel, about Palestinians, about Arabs, about Christians and Muslims, and the antagonisms in Lebanon, in Beirut, which I think ricochets and resonates in other places. But those are my footnote. This allows a conversation about how, in a society that prided itself on its intellectual and humanistic foundation, the height of the Enlightenment had been reached. And yet, we went back to the ultimate in the science of race. And why is that important today? Because for some of you, you will be following periodically at least new genetic studies. And I teach a course with a microbiologist. I always say I'm in pre-kindergarten, and I advance each year that we teach the class. I advance by being left behind. She thinks that I know a lot. I think that she knows a lot, so we work perfectly together. But the new way in which racial thinking has come in the back door through genetic sciences is phenomenal. And this is how Paul Ryan, some of you who are familiar with American politics, suddenly has discovered that he's Jewish thanks to Skip Gates. I will leave that as a parenthesis. But now he feels he can say L'chaim, and he's found his 3% Ashkenazi roots. This is a real problem, because much of this research is now taking place in Israeli research institutes. And some of it is taking place among Israeli researchers who are not necessarily born in Israel, but Israeli researchers who have their own biases. And we have to confront that. We can't just pretend that it's not there. And once those research projects that dictate who is Jewish according to DNA results are published, they are then used, because you can write somebody in and you can write somebody out. And we're back to this. Okay, we're back to 19th century. So again, as I say, I'm just putting little points of that you can pursue on your own and you can read about on your own. I just would like to provoke you with some seeds of thought. The next slide that I have here deals with one of the issues that I believe are a challenge in a lot of institutions and in a lot of countries. But it's different in different countries. It's most acute in the United States and Anglo-Saxon countries, which is, how does anti-Semitism become a non-issue on campuses? It's another way of saying, how are Jews written out of multicultural studies? And it goes under different vocabulary, diversity issues and so forth. Jews are written out. This is part of the debate of Jews are white. Now, when I left Israel in 1990, in Hebrew, in texts in Hebrew, in everyday language, popular language, you would hear certain words that were, could be derogatory, but they were not part of everyday language. The notion of speaking of white Jews and of black Jews was not there. In 20 years, it has become gradually, although not so gradually depending how old you are, it has instituted itself into the English language. And therefore, I come back to this debate in the foreword, there's a discussion about white Jews versus black Jews, Jews of color. This is a definitive problem also in conceptualizing how you put together a course on anti-Semitism. The point of departure, your point of departure and your vocabulary. If there's a discussion of white Jews and Jews of color, what does that actually mean when you translate it into Israel in the Middle East? Is Israel an anomaly in the Middle East? And I would argue no, and therefore some vocabulary needs to be removed from the classroom. And how do you do that? Well, it's the choice of texts that you compile. If you compile texts which are going to reinforce an idea, then the idea is reinforced. So footnote number 3, reading reference that's not quite related, but that I highly recommend, is Barbara and Karen Field's book, Fields, they're sisters, Racecraft. Racecraft, like witchcraft, racecraft. So here are a couple of points. What is the diaspora? It's not really a question, but just to think about, to note it. What is diaspora? How has diaspora become part of theories of postmodernism, theories of postcolonialism? How has the notion of diaspora been divorced from Jews, which is where it was being discussed initially, the Jewish diaspora. And what is a Jewish diaspora? What is a diaspora? A diaspora means that you have been displaced, dispersed from a homeland. So again, what are Jews? Who are Jews? Where do Jews come from? How do your students think about Jews? How do you think about Jews? If you're thinking of it only in terms of social science categories, you are already stuck in a quandary. Because if you're in social science categories, your categories are Jews a religion? Are they a religious group? Are Jews an ethnic group? Are Jews a racial group? Are Jews a rhetorical metaphor? Are they a trope? Well, maybe the existence of Jews are the precise juxtaposition, the opposition, in fact, to social science categories. Jews are the group to be used to challenge the way that social science categories function, and therefore the way that they are researched. Not all Jews are religious or at all practice. Some Jews are atheists, and some Jews are Marxist, socialists, Trotskyists in the past, and some Jews are ultra-Orthodox, and some Jews today would like to have the monopoly of deciding who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew, and this is a significant issue in Israel. Less so outside of Israel, but this is a major issue within Israel today, as I'm speaking today, as of July 19th. One of the laws that was passed was the nationality law, but it's only one of the laws, and among the other laws are open discussions about who is going to determine who is a Jew, even within Israel. So this is not necessarily a topic that will fit into all of your courses, but it's something you should be aware of. Okay? Again, your course goals. Are your course goals political? Or are they pedagogical? Do you hope in the long term that your students, we all know that even us as when we were students, you don't remember everything, you don't retain everything. And most of you, I suspect, like me, don't expect that your students are going to retain everything. You hope that they're going to be building a body of knowledge that will be reinforced as they decide the direction that they're going to go in if they decide to stay within academic circles, and if not, just to make them whole human, better citizens of the world, as at Grinnell we like to say. If your goals are political, the question is, are you going to enter your classroom from a position of advocacy? And there are many people who believe in the notion of advocacy. Journalists who believe in the notion of advocacy, professors who believe in advocacy, and so, we can go down a list. The problem with advocacy is that it is a partisanship that can very quickly become propaganda. And so again, this is something to grapple with on your own. And so, I have this list of words that are all the kind of P words: prescriptive, polemic, political, propaganda, partisanship. They all fit into preconceptions and premises. What are your preconceptions? What are your points of departure? What's your perspective? That affects how you present history and histories and history of ideas. Do you leave out what is inconvenient, or do you bring in what is inconvenient, even if you have to say, we can't deal with this topic, but I would like it on your radar. So if your course is on anti-Semitism, and you don't want it to be a course about the right of Israel to exist, or about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have a tension in the classroom in terms of expectations, and yes, unless you make that clear. Because students are thinking about those who are politically active, where is this course taking me? The course which I prepared during the workshop, and which I then finessed and actually taught this past semester, and which I will teach again under a different title next semester, was interesting for many reasons, and some of the material that I put in the reading packet are drawn from that course. And I realized that I didn't do some I didn't clean it up, so you kind of see partial syllabus, partial not. What was interesting was that many of the Jewish students in the class, not all of whom self-identify publicly as Jewish, and definitely most of whom, except for two, do not state that they are Jewish in other classes, they tended to be much more critical and they were itching to get to certain topics, and I wasn't going there. And as we moved towards the end of the semester, they were increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that I wasn't going to allow a debate over BDS in class, which is really where they wanted to go. And what was interesting to me was that I had a couple of students who self-identified as Christian, and I had one student who was from Pakistan who had taken a course on fashion with me, the politics of fashion, and he liked me, so he wanted to take another class with me. And he also was the treasurer of student government, which was kind of nice. And he took this class, and he was very honest, and on the first day he said, I'm taking this class because I want to take a class with Professor Katya, but also because my brother said, why would I want to take a class on anti-Semitism? The Jews are evil. So he took the class, and that was great. And one of the exercises I had in the class do was to pair up and to prepare a course or a workshop where they would be teaching about anti-Semitism. So they had to not tell me what the content would be, but they had to discuss the question of target audience and definitions and what they expected. And so I paired this Pakistani Muslim student with a Jewish student who was very Jewish and also very left, and also kind of raised with Hillel, but also with Montessori background and Montessori education. Now he's discovered that his mother belonged to Habonim because we've been texting and writing over the summer, and he wanted to go on birthright, and so I didn't know what to tell him. And finally, Habonim, Hashemet Seir, has a birthright, those of you who know what birthright is, and so he's going to go on that birthright, so he's very happy about that. And then he discovered that his mother belonged to Habonim. So this was kind of circuitous. But I paired this Jewish student, self-consciously Jewish, very pro-Israel, very critical of the Israeli government, with this Pakistani Muslim student, and they produced the best workshop completely. But what was useful was that the Pakistani student with the Jewish student was able to think about how would he speak to a group of his friends in Pakistan whose point of departure is that that Jews are evil, that Israel shouldn't exist, and they're very pro-Palestinian. And one other topic, they never think about partition. I had thrown in, as a footnote, during the class one day when I was trying to explain something, that Ben-Gurion accepted partition. We never go back to that in public discussions. You all know that, yes? This was about the same time that India accepted partition with Pakistan, which I said could allow them to explore it elsewhere. I don't have the tools. I don't have enough information about South Asia. But they can go and look up, what did partition mean? What were the debates over partition in the 1940s, not in 2018? How, therefore, did their grandparents debate the issues? That allowed for depth of historical perspective, and also for them to think about, without all the detailed encyclopedic information, how do arguments unfold, and how do they change, and how do people that are in conflict come to forget about that conflict because it's not convenient, or remember it and then over-exaggerate its significance? How are political conflicts fueled opportunistically? All of those are questions that cannot necessarily be addressed in a classroom, but they can be thrown out. They can be noted. You can ask your student, okay, this is a footnote, this is a side note, this is something you might want to explore in the future. How do we think about it? I'm thinking now because of Nigeria, since you're here. But how do we remember, and then they don't have to know it, but do you know about Biafra? You can say to your students, and they're going to say no. I guarantee you that 99%, I will be very surprised if they say yes. Have you ever heard of the Igbo? No. Have you ever heard of Yoruba? Yes, because that is now popular. Okay? I can say to them, what do you know about Swahili? And they'll say, well, that's an African language. And I'll say, yeah, it is an African language, but how did it come about? Oh, yeah, by the way, there was slavery in East Africa. And guess who ran the slave trade in East Africa? People who ran slaves, who who engaged in the slave trade, they were working for profit. It's not going to be explained simply with racism, or with anti-Semitism, or with anti-Islam, or with anti-Black. We have to use other tools. But the main point is that you've thrown out the idea and you've allowed students to think about something that they might not have thought about. And also, it allows you to think about what analogies work and what analogies don't. What analogies reinforce preconceptions and what analogies undermine those preconceptions. So I've mentioned thinking about your criteria, your selection of material. On Jews and the Middle East, I want to come back just to that because that raises the question of who is indigenous to the land. And therefore, how do we think about Jews? The question of are Jews white or not white bypasses the fact that there is a history of almost 3,000 years in which even the idea of whiteness didn't exist. So if we think about whiteness as privilege and not just about color, especially in the United States, somewhat in Europe, and I think that Europe is a little bit different because there are reminders all the time in Europe of World War II, and there are not those reminders, and before, and there are not those reminders in the United States. So in the Midwest, American Jews who are fourth, fifth generation have effectively become Christian, except that they're Jewish. I want to give you an example of this. This is really the reason I put this up. Oh, this, by the way, these are two books which are phenomenal. They're excellent. But where do they become not useful? They become not useful when this is the beginning and the end of the discussion of Jews, because it keeps Jews as white. When I use it in the context of also discussing, and this is why I said about racecraft, I use it also in the context of Black Americans and the idea that, okay, I can see that, like I'm going off on too many zigzags. Parenthesis. In colonial America, there was slavery, right? Colonial America begins with indentured servants from England and Ireland, poor people. They were essentially slaves, because few lived out their term. And then there were Africans. The African slave trade wins out. It's more economical. It's harder for Black people to disappear into the country. You need eventually a rationale for why people of African descent are going to be enslaved when you have the ideology of freedom. You don't need an explanation when you don't have an ideology of freedom. You only need an explanation for why some people can be enslaved and others can't. In the United States, what almost everybody has forgotten, except those who deal with the topic, is that the United States never defined, quote unquote, Black people, Negroes, all the different words that have been used to define people of African descent, never defined them by color, only defined by ancestry. There has never been an a legal definition of a Black person, of a Negro, that is by color. It's legally only by ancestry, and there was a reason. Does anybody, I'll throw the question out, but does anybody know why that would be?
Is it constitutionally based?
No. And then you can think about why hi David, why Jewish ancestry, or why automatically Jews are Jews either through conversion or because their mothers are Jewish.
At least in the context of slavery, you have slaves who are white.
Yes, they're not white. They look white, and their vocabulary is important. The reason was about property, solely property. You know who delivered a baby, a baby drops out still, even though we have new technologies, still babies are delivered by people who have vaginas. I don't mean to be graphic, I'm not usually graphic. But this is certainly, a fact. It was a fact then, it may be changing, I don't know, maybe the labs will produce babies in another way, but still today. So therefore, if you stole the cattle, the baby cows of, what are they called, calves, if you stole calves from somebody, that's theft. And if you stole the child of a woman, that would be theft. And so in the 1690s, this was a problem because white men, Englishmen as they were called, Englishmen, and white was a euphemism when it was used for Christian, in fact were having sex with slaves. So women were having babies. And the issue was not what color were they. It never was an issue of what color were they. And in the early slave literature, Harriet Jacobs would be an example. The question is not what color are you and therefore what status do you have. And that's another reason why the title of my book. It was never about color. It has become, discussions have rotated around color more recently. This is important because women, therefore, are the ones who give birth and who have the next generation. In Jewish tradition, it's the main reason that the child of a Jewish mother is Jewish, and that includes in the womb, is because of rape and keeping babies within the community rather than having them excommunicated before they're even born as a consequence of an illegitimate birth. So this is fairly important, and I don't remember why I went through that. But I was going to come to both Fanon, but before Fanon, I want to come to James Baldwin. Oh, I didn't keep Baldwin? I must have kept Baldwin. So one of the things that James Baldwin said in a very important article in 1967, a very controversial article, and there's a reason why I've chosen this article, and I'll tell you in a moment, but he was questioned, and there was a huge controversy. I was a teenager at that time, and blacks and Jews in New York City really were at odds with each other. It was very, very contentious. But he argued that Jews have effectively assimilated into Christian America. The desire was to be like Christians and to assimilate. And that is the beginning of a process of whitening. So what is whitening? Whitening is about privilege. But there were many people of African descent, and that's how American law described people who were of African descent. They described it as of African nativity or African descent in the, after the Civil War, when citizenship is returned to former slaves. It is disappearing, it is becoming like. Now, how did this happen? Well, it happened in many different ways, but two that are significant are two American films, Gentleman's Agreement, which received the Oscar, and at the same time a film called Crossfire. Both films are somewhat boring to students. I tend to show Gentleman's Agreement, and they're bored. And I have had students say, please, can you not show that film? And I say, well, I have to. But can you just show an expert? And I say, well, no, because you need to go through the tediousness of it to understand. But in both of the films, the idea is to communicate that Jews are like Christians. We go to church, they go to temple. But that's not everything that makes for Jews. And again, why is it important to bring this into the classroom? Because of the question of indigenousness, indigeneity. Okay? If Jews are white, and then there happen to be Jews of color, we completely write out the Jewish experience of the East, including the beginning and including the majority of Jews from Arab countries, from North Africa, from the Middle East, and that also then will include India and Ethiopia and other places. Now, what are some of the challenges in a class where students are aware of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and really they want to be dealing with BDS? And one of the purposes of this project, of this seminar, I'm going to finish in these 5 minutes, one of the purposes of this project, of your seminar, is to confront political anti-Semitism without becoming a politician in the classroom. Okay? It's being able to think about points of departure. It's being able to reposition the Jewish experience, not starting with Europe. You don't need to start with Europe, and you don't need to put Europe at the center. You put Europe in the larger context as one of the places where the Jewish presence, as a consequence of exile, occurred. So you might ask the question, yes, but the height of Christian anti-Semitism was in Europe. This is true, and it's also true by complete accident, because the Nazis had already reached North Africa, and had in fact set up camps in Tunisia, and had already sent some Jews from Algeria to Europe, to the camps in Europe. So purely because they were defeated, the extermination camps did not extend to North Africa. Why is this significant? Because it means that there's not a juxtaposition between Palestinian and Palestinian rights in the Middle East in opposition to Jews who are colonizers from Europe. Therefore, white people came to the Middle East, took over this land in conflict with all the brown people. We can ignore Ahmed Tamimi and the other people who are Muslim, who are blonde and blue-eyed. But really, this is the white intrusion. If the starting point is not the Middle East, if the starting point is not the complicated history of Jews and Jewish history and definitions, it is impossible to come full circle and to say Israel belongs in the Middle East. It's not an anomaly. It's not an intrusion. And then I do have to say this last sentence, which is not about national symbols, but is about the nationality law. I don't think that the course that I offered last semester will be taught the same way if the nationality law stays in place. It is therefore important to me not to pretend that I can't deal with that. I have to deal with that topic in a classroom, even if it's on the side. So one of the ways I would recommend to deal with these issues is to highlight the opposition inside Israel. If you get sidetracked on debates of the BDS, you won't get out of that loop. That discussion, the BDS will guide you. But if you stay within the context of opposition, which is pro-Israel, which is Zionist, which believes in the national liberation movement of the Jewish people and believe that Israel is its actualization, you will have a much easier time to discuss issues of multiculturalism, which include economy, politics, law, literature, food, you name it. Go down the grocery list. And so that's really what I want to share with you. So challenges and contexts.
And thank you very much for an amazing tour de force.
Okay, we can turn that off.
Yeah, can you lock the light? It's blinding here. Thank you. There's a lot of questions. So I'm going to take the prerogative and ask you two very quick questions. One, you said you finessed your course, you were able to finesse your course into the department. Can you explain sort of the process of what you went to and why did you have to finesse it given your stature at the university? And then I have another question to ask you quickly. Okay. The second question is, it's more on the content of your lecture and of your work. So the United States is a very racialized society, deeply racialized. It's based on racism, from slavery to the moment. Very heavily racialized. And the fact that Jews are becoming white is a whole interesting process in and of itself. As you were speaking and talking about Israel and the Middle East, as you were talking and speaking about the Middle East and issues of racism and multiculturalism, which is certainly a layer of reality there, I was reminded of when Malcolm X went to Mecca, and he was sort of blown away by the fact that that space wasn't racialized when his experience was in the United States. So to what extent that we in the United States kind of put on this sort of American lens when we're looking at parts of the world that are, I won't say completely different, but extraordinarily different. And we're in a moment when the struggle, I don't think, is primarily a racist struggle. It's a struggle probably that's heavily influenced by religion and the very narrow forms of religion and identity, and whether the other, namely the only other that has self-determination in the region, the Jewish state, and that's a loaded term now too, but the Jewish state, and its right for self-determination in a region where Islamist, jihadist identities and rhetoric and ideology would never accept the other in any space, being equal to a good Muslim. So can American intellectuals and policymakers with this lens and this, reality and deep history perceive these conflicts more accurately somehow? How do Americans wrap their head around a space which is very different? There's a very different reality and history informing the conflict there. How do we do that?
So, I don't remember, did I say I finessed my class?
Yeah, I quote.
Oh, maybe I said it. Sometimes I say things and I have to backtrack. It's not the computer. Your question is you cannot change the world. I'm not teaching the world. No one of us are teaching the world, but we are teaching a world, and that's the world in our classroom. So I can't deal with all of America. There are a lot of, Fanon, one of the things he said was that he was writing his book because there were a lot of idiots in the world. And it took him a long time, and it's the very beginning of his Black Skin, White Masks. And that's my point of departure. So given that, I can only teach and hope that the students in my class, that there will be, if there's one, and they go out in the world and they change two, that is a change. Politics, that's one thing. The second thing to remember, and I was a student of Nomi Chazan, and then I worked with her for 10 years, and I deeply admire her work. I admire her analysis, her way of thinking, her logic, and of course I admire my mother. Some things I haven't said about you because it's so easily accessible on the internet, which includes that you can find a picture of my mother with Menachem Begin and Sadat on the visit. She's the only woman in the picture, so that's easy to find. That's to throw that out for you. But politicians, and we know this because Hamas and Israel are going to be signing an agreement. Now, you may not find a lot of information in Hebrew or English, and I don't read Arabic, so I can't say about Arabic right now because it's like fish in water. Trying to find the headlines is hard, but it was on Galei Tzahal, the Israeli army radio this morning. In the next by the end of August, okay, maybe yes, maybe not, but what is certain is it will be signed. And a lot of money is going to be made once Gaza is opened up. There's a lot of money. People who are in development take their time. Politicians are not about virtue and morality, ever. I interviewed an Israeli Ethiopian Knesset member at the time, not the one who's coming to speak, who's a member of Likud. And I asked him about friends, and he said, politicians have no friends. Politicians have allies and adversaries, and they're never in the same place. They switch. So I guess in a way, that's sort of a brief, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but that's kind of an answer, that Americans generally tend to be very provincial, narrow-minded, and they are getting more and more so. And the President of the United States, if he represents American ways of thinking, we have a problem. The world has a problem.
Okay, so I saw Tyrone and then Suni. And just before you ask the question, sorry, David Hirsch will be speaking later, walked into the room, so welcome, David.
David has also been very influential in my thinking before I met him here. From the beginning, from 2006 when you were writing. So why? Because David is of the left and a Zionist and has had to fight the struggle against anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism for years in a much more hostile environment than I am in. So
I just wanted to say I appreciated your talk. I think it was very thought-provoking, so I wanted to thank you for coming to talk with us. So my question is, when is it okay to acknowledge the race or group of a people over the profit of a situation? In the sense that if someone is doing something horrendous to a race or a group of people for profit, do you think that it is more important to look at the value of the situation over the discrimination or prejudice of that group or race of people? And if so, why?
Well, okay, so the first thing that I would say, and this is the first thing I would say, it's a very good question, but the first thing I would say is that the first thing I do in every class I teach, doesn't matter what the topic is, including the politics of fashion, is that no one is allowed to use the word race as a noun, ever. Only as a verb. And the reason they have to use it as a verb is it's a constant constant vocabulary reminder that nobody has a race. They are raced as. You are positioned in a particular place. There is an agent. It is not from within. So I can't go off into a whole discussion about Stuart Hall or Du Bois, but I would just point that out and remind you of Barbara Fields. So racism has to be named as racism. I often have a lot of tension with my colleagues because I don't believe in talking about racial diversity. I believe in talking about racism. I don't believe in talking about multiculturalism. I believe in talking about the different groups who have contributed, who are erased, who are omitted, and so forth. So I think that if one speaks about racist behavior, there's a wonderful example that Fields offers. It probably can translate to other situations, but she disputes the sentence which we often hear in the press: he was killed or she was attacked because they were black. As if black skin somehow caused a problem. The problem was caused by the person whose hand is on the trigger. They had a problem in how they translate whatever it is that they're seeing. The fear, the antagonism, the hatred, whatever it is. So I think that that's really important. So yes, I think it's important to talk about racism, about xenophobia, about nationalism, which becomes discriminatory, and then to understand the roots of that. There is a wonderful article written, I think it's in 1922, in the Journal of Negro History, and it's called Poor Whites and Negroes, 1920s, by a black historian. And he is writing about why groups that should be allies in the 1920s, this is also the period of socialism, why they're not. What is it about poor whites that make them so violent and so antagonistic? And the reason that he gives is the following. I mean, I'm doing this in very short, but that slaves had the monopoly over crafts. They were the skilled workers. End of slavery, you have to start paying people. Poor whites who had been excluded want those jobs. There's a parallel with 2018 or 2016 to be made. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I hope it goes part of the way. If not, you can ask me afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate your talk. When we did the exercise with groups and groups, it was interesting that a few of us can only go so far as slavery and stop. As African Americans, we are a forced migrant group into the nation. So my question is, when looking at the Jewish plight and the need for a homeland and acquiring that homeland, it's very interesting that that conversation also blends and is parallel to the African American struggle, especially with regards to immigration and the Pan-African movement.
Yeah.
So do you see the value of doing a comparative analysis of Zionism and Pan-Africanism in the class?
I do, and there is an image I didn't show from 1948, the Pan-African Conference in Manchester, where there's a placard that can be seen in the picture, down with anti-Semitism. I think that analogies are have to be handled very carefully so that they're not over-exaggerated. And that's even true between people. We both might have experienced prejudice, but the moment that I say, oh, that's exactly like my experience, that's not true. And I say that as somebody who, and this is part of the reason why we don't, there are many reasons why we don't, but one of the reasons why we don't live partly in Israel. Some years ago, my middle son, who was in Golani, and that probably helped him to survive, but he got leukemia and he almost died. He arrived in the hospital and the doctors didn't understand why he was still walking even. He should have been dead. Fortunately, not a very Jewish thing to do, but fortunately, he did not die. My daughter was the donor. My other son was not, so my daughter was the donor. And so he has survived, but he also lives in Omaha and stays near the hospital that saved his life. And so this is now 6 years, and you know, Baruch Hashem, he's okay. But it was during that period that I really understood what I understood as a principle, which is no two experiences are the same. They're not the same. There's no such thing as normal. Normal changes. And how you experience, you know, any of these life-threatening moments is different. No two people went through the horror of the Holocaust, either as having been in hiding or having been in a concentration camp and survived, or being a survivor, like my grandparents, knowing that your closest relatives, until they died, they suffered terribly. This would be true for Rwanda, this would be true for Burundi, this is true for the former Yugoslavia. So the analogies need to be careful, and if you can give your students the tools to be careful with the analogy, that's important. That's one. And in particular, the root causes are always important. I happen to believe that root causes they are cultural, they are political, but that they can be traced many times to money and to, follow the money trail. And the third, just as one other point, the tricky problem with African American history, and I'll use the term African American even though I don't like that term, is that it's easy to forget that there are white people in that genealogy and sometimes native populations. It's not convenient. And so another book that I would recommend is Octavia Butler's Kindred, because she has that in there. The protagonist cannot be born without saving her white great person. That book is underread. It's not read enough, but it explains everything, in a sense, for American history.
So we have a lot of questions and we're running out of time. So Irving, please be very concise.
Katya, be very concise.
41 years in higher education, and the thing that really concerns me is this apparent transformation taking place, that it's, at least in America, it appears that education has become more indoctrination. There was something you mentioned before. You said politicians aren't moral. It seems to me that one of the things missing in education, even in higher education, is the moral dimension. So for someone like me that doesn't teach anymore but comes in and gives lectures on something like the Holocaust, to add to your alliteration of P's, it seems to me that parameters is important, but what's happening today is that students are hijacking classes. They're not accepting the parameters that you're prescribing. So my question is something like this. The Holocaust, you said you don't accept any questions about whether or not Israel has the right to exist. I'm sure you're aware of the teacher in New York whose assignment to students was to justify the final solution, So can't we cross that line with what you called advocacy and deal with the moral dimension from at least the standpoint that not only what would you have done if you lived in that time, but today confronting racism, today confronting anti-Semitism, and emphasizing the moral imperative?
When I said at the very beginning that each of us, and that's true even for a talk, and I have taken the license to be more informal here than I would if I was reading a paper that was crafted. We all have to ask, what are our goals? In a way, a goal would be, what is the moral legacy I want to leave with my students? I don't happen to deal well with emotional issues in the classroom. I'm not interested in students breaking down in tears. I don't even allow it. In a way, what does that mean, I don't allow it? My syllabus has on it I showed a scene from Glory where I have to qualify that. You can cry, and I will offer you a tissue. But don't cry and expect me to stop and say, oh, I feel so bad that you're crying. I'm not going to do that. The world is full of people who are suffering. At the age of 8, my mother became homeless. Her sister, who was 17, had a very nice middle-class Austrian Viennese life, would have been a very neurotic, probably Hausfrau if she had lived. But she committed suicide because she couldn't get over the trauma. So, get over it. That's my attitude about students. This is in America. This is at Grinnell, Iowa. I have moral imperatives built in, but I don't necessarily say it. But that's where I'm saying that each of you as educators have to decide not what goes in your syllabus, not what you necessarily say, but it's going to affect how you craft your syllabus. You have goals that are curricular goals, but you have choices of what text you're going to use to further those goals. So you can choose X or you can choose Y. As an example, for me, I chose in my class Carrie Nelson's article. And I told my class specifically, and I've done this in postmodernism a few years ago as well, I don't read Judith Butler. I don't care what Judith Butler has to say. I'm quite upfront about that. And all the students who are coming from GWS resent my saying that. And I look at their eyes go big and I say, you know what? This is me. I do not like Judith Butler. I don't respect Judith Butler's opinion. And I'm not teaching her. But if you want to bring Judith Butler in, I will make space for you to bring her in and for you to read her and for you to discuss her. But on my syllabus is Carrie Nelson, so therefore you have to read the Carrie Nelson article. If you want to read Judith Butler, you can do so. So I chose why Carrie Nelson and not somebody else. I chose Carrie Nelson because his argument is very well crafted, it's sophisticated, and he directly engages with Judith Butler in a serious manner so that Judith Butler has to acknowledge that she's been engaged with seriously. So for me, that's a moral choice. I wouldn't call it that necessarily. I didn't think of it in those terms. I thought of it more in terms of political ethics, but I think it's the same thing. So that would be, I agree with you. We are, you know, I don't always like to agree with everything. I think that one has to be very careful about the advocacy and the propaganda, but having done so, there are going to be texts that we're going to find difficult to use and others are going to find easy to use. I don't use bell hooks. I don't use Angela Davis. Same reasons. They can read them on their own. I can direct students. But in the class, I need students to have clear thinking as to the maximum possible so that they can leave the classroom at least having heard the possibility of a discussion that is contentious but that is conducted at an intellectual level that I believe is sophisticated, not polemical. Does that answer your question?
I would recommend that you speak to our colleague Amy, because I think the two of you have.
We did.
So I'm going to be very strict. So Ansel, Rafi, and Mandisa, you have 20 seconds to articulate a question. We'll collect them, and you'll have like 2 or 3 minutes to respond.
Okay.
We're over time, so please be succinct.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Katya, first of all, for an engaging discussion. When you discuss the whitening of the Jewish community in America, I would like you to elaborate on your equation of that to a religious affiliation. Because for me, if this be the case, Black Americans would be more white than the Jewish community because we're more Christian. And when I think about whiteness in America, I think about this American idea of a European melting pot, where many American Jews fit into this sort of identity. So that's my question.
So, and Rafi?
I had an anecdote, but it will take more than 20 seconds. And to keep Charles calm, I'm going to skip it maybe another time. I have a question. In England, when you deal with all these issues, you need to balance everything against everything. So if I invite an Israeli, I have to invite a Palestinian. If I'm teaching from a Zionist perspective, I have to teach from another perspective, contra-Zionist perspective. Not necessarily pro-Zionist, but at least English, non-Jew sort of perspective. Is it the same in the United States?
I don't know if it's the same in the United States. Some people yes, some people no.
No, in your experience.
Okay.
I don't believe in that kind of balance, so I don't do it.
Okay. And Mandisa, please. Just to clarify the last question.
Thanks for this.
Thank you.
You've really just floored me. I'm from South Africa. I'm going to keep it short because I think we'll talk about this after this. How do you define whiteness? Because where I come from, everything is racialized.
Yeah. I'm glad that you raised it, and I didn't have time. It's in my notes to talk about the apartheid Zionism analogy. Very quickly. Because this was shorthand, there are other things I could have said. I do not, in my course, and the articles that I gave you, or the few that I offered you under whiteness, their point of departure is not let's focus only on whiteness. I am an opponent of whiteness studies. I think it had its place in the beginning. It opened up a critique. I think the biggest problem today is that there is an obsession with whiteness studies. It detracts from everything. It's not the history. And I was saying to Valerie the other day, in a way, it's important to, perhaps to go back to 19th century texts. That there is a politics to the way in which, and we don't have time for that, but there is a politics of the history of whiteness studies. There's an epistemology. There is a history of ideas. Whiteness studies has detracted, and it's been bad all the way across because young black American students don't know anything about American history today. White American students don't know anything about history. And American Jews have become very Americanized, and it depends where one is. So in the United States, there are also today a lot of Jews of North African and Middle Eastern background who have been born in the US. They're no longer immigrants. It's not like 20 years ago. They've actually been born in the US. They speak American English. They went to American schools, or they went to American Jewish schools, or they went even to American Jewish yeshivot. And in that sense, they have acquired the vocabulary of whiteness. Those on the left who use whiteness studies have acquired a vocabulary that has accepted as a default whiteness as having always been there. And that's part of the problem. And let me just say this, I know that there's no time, and this is sort of off topic. I think one of the mistakes that the left is making in the United States today, and Europe has adopted the vocabulary of white, because Joel, you were talking about Belgium yesterday. I had a Belgian student in my class, Jewish Belgian, who wrote that she was white. And she said, well, in Belgium, everybody thinks, all the Jews think they're white. This is something that's very, very new. This is not their grandparents' generation. But one of the mistakes that the left is making, and has been making in the immigration debate, has been not highlighting, not putting money and really highlighting how vocabulary and images of immigration before the 1924 law was passed. The Irish, the Jews, the Italians were depicted in the most egregious ways, but it's actually the same images and sometimes the exact same vocabulary that's now used against current immigrants. And that's worldwide. But by not doing that, we make it seem as if whiteness has always existed as is. But I would define whiteness as privilege, and I would say we shouldn't be spending a lot of time on it. But we fall into that trap. And so how do we not do that? We don't choose certain texts.
So on behalf of everybody here, thank you for an amazing